Welcome to Formatting a Narrative Genealogy. My name is Alice Hoyt-Veen. I am a board-certified genealogist and a lifelong family historian. And I've got some good news for you today. You can write an engaging, pleasurable narrative genealogy and still meet genealogical standards for excellence. Anyone can write, including you, and anyone can meet these standards. By the end of this hour, you'll understand the basics for structuring and formats, and you'll have some ideas of decisions to make to get you started on this pleasurable, joyful process of putting together your research results in an engaging and yet credible manner. So if you haven't done so already, I encourage you to download the syllabus and go through the slides with the syllabus. At the bottom of page 3 are some resources that we will be discussing as we go along. And on page 4, you'll find a small example of a structure of a genealogy to kind of help jog your memory as you start to apply what you learn here today to your own work. Before we get started, the content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the creator, that's me, and do not necessarily reflect the views of FamilySearch International and RootsTech. With that said, let's get started. Why should you write your genealogy? Many of us get so caught up in the thrill of the hunt, the search for answers, and the joy of discovery that we really never get to that point where we're ready to share. And that is a very important part of being a genealogist, sharing what we learn with others. We want to share by identifying and proving identities and kinship. We want to share where each person fits in the family in generational and historical context. All of these pieces are truly what are part of a family, and we want to learn that and then share it with others. And we can do that through technology. We could create a website, or we can write a blog or a video, and those are fun ways to share. But they don't necessarily stand the test of time, do they? Because one thing we know about technology is what works today may not work tomorrow. The written word endures forever. It will be as relevant and readable 100 years from now as it is today. And writing can be just as fun as all those high-tech marvels out there. So we need to share it in a written format for our families. What inspires you to study a particular branch of your family? Emma Blanche Martin was my inspiration for learning more about the Martin family. She was my grandmother's mother, and she died when my grandmother was only 3 years old. She died very young, at the age of 27, and this is the only photograph of her that any of our family have. So for years she's been a source of fascination as our family members have looked at that very sweet, almost mysterious face and wanted to know her story. That inspired me to study the Martins. Look for what inspires you, and then get inspired to do the research, find the answers, learn the story, and share. In this session today, we are discussing one way to present a written genealogy, a narrative genealogy. And the basic goals for a type of narrative genealogy that we'll discuss is, first of all, establishing and confirming identities, and then establishing and confirming relationships or kinship between individuals and families, between families and generations. Those are your basic goals. The third goal you'll have then is to place these individuals and families in generational context, within the context of the family overall. That's how we write a narrative genealogy. Let's dig into it a little more deeply then and see how it all works. The type of narrative genealogy that we are discussing here today then begins with an early ancestor, perhaps the earliest ancestor that you know of for your family. And then it discusses these ancestors one generation at a time in descending order from the earliest to the most recent that you'd care to include. So we might start with an early ancestor. For Emma, I went from her earlier ancestors to her great-grandparents, Josiah and Susanna Martin, and then her grandparents, John and Nancy Needler Martin. Then we discuss her parents, William Henry and Mary Turner Martin. And finally, Emma's generation. That's where I ended my story. But I could have gone on. I could have carried it forward to her children's generation and down to the present generation, my generation. So that's a descending style coming down through time, and that's what we'll be discussing. It's decision-making time. Before we put pen to paper, or before we open up that Word document on our computer, we have a few choices we need to consider in what and how we want to share our family information. The first decision then is, what is the purpose of your presentation? Who will your audience be? It may be that you'd like to present your research results in a genealogical magazine or a scholarly journal. Obviously, the scope and the length of such an article may be more limited than it would be for your family. It will also need to conform to that particular publication's style and formatting guidelines. That's a consideration. If you decide that you'd like to become a board-certified genealogist through the Board for Certification, you will be submitting a portfolio that includes a kinship determination project. This works well as a narrative genealogy, but again, your scope and the content and the length of it may be limited. Finally, your family, and this is perhaps what most of us really aspire to, at least at some level. That gives us much more latitude as far as length and scope, how many people we include and who we choose to talk about, all those stories. So each purpose and audience will have a different set of requirements to consider. You may like to take your work and present it to different audiences. So you'll be writing perhaps more than one way. And that is what I did with Emma's story. It was part of my first certification portfolio as a kinship determination project. But I wrote it up a little differently for my family. And I'm going to show you some of the ways it differed as we work through the rest of our formatting exercise together. But the scope and the content were longer for family, and some of the stories and things, it just depends on who your audience is and your purpose. Purpose and audience then will have an impact on the scope of the work you present. And even for family, you'll want to ask yourself, who do I wish to include as part of this written work? Do I want to go all the way back to the earliest ancestor that I have found and tell every story down through time? Or do I want to start perhaps with a later ancestor and come forward through time? Do I want to discuss all the siblings in each family and tell their stories as well? All of these will determine the scope and the content that you include. What about complex family situations? And we all have those, where we have multiple marriages within a family and some stepchildren perhaps adoptees, a lot of different scenarios. And how will we handle those as part of our project? We need to consider the ethical concerns and the impact what we write may have on living family members. Plus, we'll need to determine how best to include these special cases in a way that is clear and doesn't confuse the reader. So all of those are determinations we must decide before we can begin our project. We may want to stick with a limited scope of surnames. Oftentimes, people will present a genealogical narrative that focuses on the family's surname. For the Martin family, perhaps, that would be a single surname study. Here are Emma's parents and her siblings. Her parents were William Henry Martin and Mary Turner, and she had two brothers, Charles and Frank. If my presentation focuses on the Martin family name, I would not carry Emma over because she, when she married, became a Dooley. Her married name was Dooley. So usually a single surname study will focus on a male line of descent. But if I choose all the descendants of the family, regardless of what their surname is, then I can bring Emma back in and all the other female ancestors and talk about them also within the study. Whether this be a written publication or a certification portfolio or for your family, all deserve those genealogical standards of excellence. And this is where the Board for Certification can help. They've developed through the years sets of genealogy standards to help guide us, all of us, to reach higher levels of excellence in our work. And this is a very small book, very common sense standards. You can purchase it on Amazon. It's published by the Board for Certification. It provides guidelines and standards for research, for documenting the sources we use, and for clear, concise, and credible writing up of our results. It's very helpful, and it's very good to have on your bookshelf as you work through your writing process. There are different formats used in genealogical writing. They are very, very similar. Some of the differences are just purely cosmetic, but the two most common styles are the register system, which was developed by the New England Historic Genealogy Society. It's been around since the 1870s. And the NGS, National Genealogical Society Quarterly System. And this one has been developed by the National Genealogical Society. It was developed in 1912. Both of these styles are used in their particular publications. So when we said you would want to consider the publication and their requirements, most publications today use one of these two styles, even if they're not these particular scholarly publications. But if you choose to present your research in the register, you'll want to use their format system. If you choose to present your information in what's called the quarterly, you'll want to use their formatting system. Getting a handle on these formats, you can get a little bit of help from your genealogical software. All the modern genealogical softwares can help you with the structures and the formats. And you go into where you would put together and choose to have it export a genealogy narrative, and it would give you some choices, register, modified style. It can get you started. It cannot write your story for you. Do not depend on it to do that. You will want to export whatever you use from your software to a word processing program, because you'll have a lot of cleanup to do, I guarantee it. Anytime you present family information, you need to keep it well organized so that people can follow along and not get confused. So we're going to work our way through the keys of structure and organization to help you present in a way that will be recognized and usable for many generations to come. Regardless of the length of your final work, whether you cover many generations or only a few generations, I like to begin by introducing the project on a large scale. So this isn't necessarily a requirement for you, but I think it's a very good idea, especially for family, to just tell them why you chose your subject and how much of the family is included in this. You know, what's the scope? How far did you go with the research, and how much are you presenting? Give maybe a historical context, kind of set the stage for the times these people lived in and the locations where they lived. So give an introduction before you start writing, and it will help you clarify to yourself as well what you want to include as you go through the writing process. Our descending genealogy then is going to discuss one generation at a time, starting back in time and working down that family tree to the most recent generation that we want to include. All our discussions will be organized by generations and then by families and individuals. Each generation is kind of like a chapter in a book. It's all together in one place, and it has a subtitle identifying which generation is being discussed. Within this little chapter in your work about each generation, you will discuss the individuals and the families that belong to that specific generation. This is the basic structure to lay it out in a way that is standardized and that others will recognize. It begins by identifying the generation, and then an introduction to that generation, a genealogical summary where an individual and their spouse as a family unit are introduced. Then, if necessary, you may need to include a proof discussion or argument. Then you can go to the life story and tell the story of this couple, the individuals in this family, what they've shared together. Once that life story is concluded, you will introduce the children of that couple and then list the children for each couple in chronological order. And of course, everything will be tied to source notes that clarify and identify where you found your information. Generation 5, that was Emma's generation. And again, I introduced this particular generation, kind of set the stage for this almost like a little chapter that I'm going to write about the people who lived in that generation, who were members of that generation. The introduction maybe again is not necessarily a requirement, but I think it's very helpful. Next is the genealogical summary. And this is a really key part of the whole structure. This is where we confirm identities and relationships for these individuals and families. Let's look at that in more detail. Our genealogical summary, then, is like a paragraph that provides basic vital statistics for an individual and their spouse. Birth, marriage, and death to establish identity and kinship. It is written in a paragraph style, and you can see that here. Here is Emma Blanche Martin's genealogical summary. All those numbers that you see right now, I don't want you to worry about those. We'll discuss those later. Right now, let's focus on the content of this paragraph. Emma Blanche Martin was born in 1872, Jefferson County, Iowa. Died in 1900 in Village Township, Van Buren County, Iowa. She married William James Dooley in 1893, Van Buren County. He was born in 1868, the son of William Dooley and Sarah Craig. He died in 1942 in Van Buren County, and after Emma died, he married for a second time to Nellie Leota Pearson in 1904 in St. Louis, Missouri. This also includes a parenthetical summary of descent. And you can see that right after Emma is introduced. This is her direct Martin line back through time. You can see her father is William Henry, and Henry is his middle name. John Howe is his middle name. William is her father, John her grandfather, Josiah, Robert, William. That's the direct line back through time. All of them carry the surname Martin, the same as Emma. So we don't need to repeat that surname Martin within that parenthetical summary of descent. If Emma was descended through a female line, you would see some changes in surnames from one generation to the next. And when that happens, you would want to include that so that it's clear what the name was that the person used at the time these people were born. Immediately following that genealogical summary, you may need to include additional information about how you determined these identities and kinship. The records aren't always clear, are they? Especially as we go back through time. Our goal is always to find as many relevant sources as we can that are reliable and independent of each other, that will confirm the vital statistics and the information that we are using. If that doesn't happen, let's say we have not been able to find this direct evidence to confirm identity, then we may have to use what's called indirect evidence, where we take clues and bits and pieces of information and evidence from a variety of sources. We may have sources that disagree with each other. We need to determine which source is correct, or if any of them are, and resolve those issues to arrive at a reliable conclusion that our readers can have confidence in. If it's that type of situation where you did not have clear-cut evidence, you will want to explain how you arrived at your conclusions. And that may need to be a brief paragraph, it may need to be several paragraphs, or a longer discussion of your sources. So for Emma, it really wasn't too difficult a case, but here in Iowa, Emma's birth predated vital records. Vital records in Iowa were not kept before the 1880s. So she didn't have a birth certificate. Her death certificate did not name her parents, but I did find an obituary for her father that identified Emma as his daughter. I found her in the 1880 census with the Martin family, and she is identified as William's daughter. And finally, on her marriage application, her parents are identified as William and Mary. So I had several sources that corroborated each other. They are independent of each other by reliable sources, and I was able to reach a reliable conclusion. So I wrote it up as a little paragraph. It was very simple in this case, but yours may be more complex. Sometimes identity is much more complicated than this. But it's a little short example of what I mean by presenting that proof as a summary or argument, where you've had to pull from different sources. Once you've introduced an individual and their spouse, and provided their vital statistics in the genealogical summary, and if necessary, you've added discussion about the evidence you used to establish this identity and kinship, then it's time to move on and tell this couple's life story. And this can be as long as you want it to be if you are writing for your family. You can include information about the individual's life, their childhood, perhaps their spouse's life as they're in their childhood, and then their life as a couple, their family life. So there's all kinds of detail that you can incorporate into the life story. You want to try to reconstruct these lives and bring them to life for your reader, to truly bring back those memories from the past. Writing the family story can be intimidating, but it doesn't need to be. The easiest way to start is to set a timeline up for your ancestor. Look at each year of their life. Look at when those major life events took place. Look at the locations where they lived and when they lived there. Look for patterns and perspectives. Look for how old they were when major life events took place. That'll help you get started. When I set up Emma's timeline, the first thing that I noticed that I had not noticed before was that she was only 3 years old when her own mother died. And that's the exact same age that her daughter Ruth was when Emma died. I noticed a lot of patterns and things that were truly significant. You know, I thought about what was that like for Emma, and I did a little more research to learn about what that was like when her mother died and what happened in the aftermath. It was there to find and to retell. Emma also left me with 2 of her autograph albums. One was from her school years, and all her school friends signed and dated it, and that helped me identify where she went to school, a little one-room schoolhouse in the country. The other autograph album was from a trip she took at the age of 16 on the train west to Kansas, where she visited her mother's family, her grandparents. And that little autograph album was the key to unlocking their identities, because the Turner family had moved to Kansas. They had not stayed in Iowa. So I learned a lot about that. I was able to reconstruct her journey from that. And although Emma did not leave any personal letters or diaries, she did live in an area where another lady lived and wrote a book called 4 Seasons, Life on a Pioneer Van Buren County Farm. And that was very similar to what Emma's experience would be. So I was able to draw on that to really reconstruct what life would have been like for Emma. I call this writing joy because we put our family, first of all, in generational context. That's the main purpose of the life story, and historical and cultural context to try to set the stage for their lives. But we can incorporate many visual aids. We can incorporate photographs and maps, documents, all kinds of things to tell their story. And we can look to social history for help. That means determining how they lived, what kind of technology did they use? If they were farmers, which this family was, how did you farm in the 1880s? What was school like in a one-room schoolhouse in the country in the 1880s? How did they travel? How did they migrate from one place to the other? They didn't have a car. All of this social history can be incorporated also. This is William Henry Martin's family about the time Emma died. She's not in the picture, but all of those people live in that tiny little house. Imagine what that was like if Emma lived with them before she was married. What a crowded household that was. Once you've told that story and recreated that marvelous life, it's time to move on to the children. So after we've wrapped up our story, we introduce the child list. And then we list each child to that couple in chronological birth order. Introducing the children means, first of all, restating the names of the parents. And I've done that here. Emma Blanche Martin and William James Dooley had the following children. Then we present the children in chronological birth order. Hazel Mary Dooley was their first child. She was born in 1895. And in that child list, I give the basic vital statistics for each child: birth, marriage, death. So Hazel was number 1, she was the oldest, and then Ruth was the second child, and I give her vital statistics as well. If I'm not going to discuss these children in more detail in their own generation later in my story, this is the place where I may want to include more about their lives. So this is where you can add that bit in. But if you're going to carry them forward and discuss them in their own right as families, then here you just want to put them in context with their vital statistics and in birth order. Finally, our source citations. And regardless of whether it's for our family or for publication or for a portfolio, documenting your sources, where you found your evidence, is truly important. If you are writing for publication or submitting a portfolio for evaluation, you will want to include your sources in footnotes, because as a scholar reads through a work like this, they want to read the narrative and then look down at the bottom of the page to see the sources. If you do that for your family, they may not really appreciate having a lot of source citations covering each page of your work. For a family narrative, then, I like to include them as endnotes, and that's perfectly acceptable. They're the very same source citations, but they're at the very end of my story, the very end of the full document. I actually had to produce then 2 different types of copy when I used this for my portfolio. One had them at the bottom as footnotes, the other at the end as the endnotes. We've already said then that narrative genealogies present information 1 generation at a time. But these all rely on numbering systems to organize and identify individuals, families, and information. So the numbering systems are really a key to clarity and avoiding confusion about where each individual fits into this family. Both the register system and the quarterly system of formatting rely on a series of numbers to help organize the structure. And there are 4 basic numbers that they both use. They use source citation numbers, generational numbers and sometimes letters, child list birth order numbers, and a unique individual identification number. And the best resource to help you understand how to use these numbers is Numbering Your Genealogy, published by the National Genealogical Society. It's just a small booklet, but it's very helpful, very clear to help you navigate this process. It's available through the NGS website, and it's listed in your syllabus on the resources page. Let's start with source citation numbers. These are numbers you are already probably very familiar with. Source citation numbers are in text. They are superscript, regular type, usually following punctuation. And for each fact that you present that is not general knowledge, you need to connect that fact to the source where you found it. So at the end of a sentence, such as this one, Emma Blanche Martin married William James Dooley on 30 November 1893 in Van Buren County. Period at the end of my sentence, and then that superscript number 1 is the clue that there should be a source associated with this fact. And that number 1 is coordinated to a number 1 in my footnote or endnote where I present the source citation. And you can see here that in my footnote I have a regular size text number 1 in the footnote. Your word processor may default to making those a superscript number also, and that's okay. It doesn't matter. The key is to connect the one in this text with the one in the note. That was easy. You are already on to source citation numbers. Now we're going to incorporate generational numbers and letters. Generational numbers and letters place individuals in generational context within the family. So American generations will be designated with numbers. The earliest American generation in a descending system will be generation 1. Robert Martin was the Martin immigrant to America from Ireland. He was the first Martin in America. Therefore, he is assigned generation 1 if he is where I begin my story. So if my presentation begins with Robert, if he's the earliest generation that I want to include in my story, he is generation 1. Then his children will be generation 2. So Josiah Martin, Robert's child, and his siblings are generation 2. Then Josiah's children would be generation 3, and their children would be generation 4, and so on. If we decide to incorporate our pre-American generations, whether they be in Europe or any other country anywhere, if they are going to be part of our story, we designate them in a different sort of way. For pre-American generations, we are going to designate them with capital letters. William Martin was the father of our immigrant Robert. But he lived in Ireland. He did not immigrate to the United States. If we include William with our story, then he is generation capital A. His father will be generation capital B. His grandfather is generation capital C, and so on back through time. Children and siblings who do not immigrate to America are designated with lowercase letters. So generation capital A is William Martin, who remained in Ireland. His children, who also remained in Ireland and who are siblings of our immigrant Robert, are designated by a generation lowercase a. That leaves us with a problem. If we want to incorporate these other European or other nationalities that remained in the old country into our story, how do we fit Robert then into the picture with his generation? Robert actually belongs to generation lowercase a, the other siblings who remained in Ireland, but he's our immigrant ancestor. So we need to designate him with both a letter and a number. He belongs to lowercase generation A, and he is number 1 in America. So A-1 means he is our immigrant ancestor, but that we have included our international kin as part of our story. So to recap, generation capital A, William Martin, remained in Ireland. Generation lowercase a, his sons and daughters who remained in Ireland. Robert, our first Martin generation in America then, is generation lowercase a-1. His American children, though, continue to be generation 2. His grandchildren, generation 3, and so on down through time. So our descending genealogies can include numbering and discussion one generation at a time. If we're going to begin our story then with that pre-American ancestor, they will be generation A, capital A, and then our immigrant will be generation lowercase a-1. But if we are going to start with Robert and not include his pre-American ancestors, he will be generation 1. Generation 2 is the second American generation, and so on. How do we include these generational designations within the structure of our narrative genealogy? Well, we have several places where these numbers belong to help us keep track of who's who and where they fit into the overall picture. When we introduce a generation as that little chapter in our work, we can identify which generation it is. So generation A-1 is our immigrant Robert to America, if we're incorporating those other ancestors as well. So it goes in our little title, our subheading. Then, regardless of which generation they belong to, we always include that in the genealogical summary. So here you see I have Robert Martin, and right after his first name, but before his surname, I have a superscript italicized A-1. That means he belongs to that generation. I also have William, his father, in the genealogical summary of descent. And you can see after William's name, I have a superscript capital A. That designates him as a pre-American ancestor. So they belong in those three places first. When we introduce the child list, we repeat that just to be sure that we've got it in there correctly. Robert A-1 Martin and Betty Hare had the following children. And then when we introduce the children in the child list, the very first child listed is designated with the next generational number. And Josiah Martin, as the oldest child, got a superscript italicized number 2 after his first name, designating that he belongs then to the next American generation, generation 2. We only do that in the child list with the first child listed. It's inferred for the others in the list. If you're feeling a little queasy at this point, especially with the lettering and some of this complication, it may seem complicated, Refer back to Numbering Your Genealogy. They have an entire chapter devoted to this topic, International Kin by John Ray. And they have a chart there to help you navigate how to place those children, particularly those ancestors that remain in the old country, into context. We'll move on then to something that's not quite so complicated, the child list birth order numbers. Child list birth order numbers. When we introduce the children right after their parents, we place them in chronological birth order. And we number that birth order using a lowercase Roman numeral followed by a period. So William Martin and Mary Turner had the following children: Charles, Emma, and Frank. 1, 2, 3. Emma was the middle child. Very simple. That's all there is to it. Finally, we have an individual identification number to assign to the individuals within our story. Individual identification numbers are Arabic numbers. They're not superscript, and they are unique to each individual who receives one. They're assigned sequentially through each generation. Spouses do not receive individual numbers, but other individuals, either in the register system or the quarterly system, will. And the way the register system and the quarterly system assign these numbers is where you see the greatest difference between the two systems. For now, let's focus on where they are and when they are assigned, and where you'll see them in the work. They're usually assigned for the first time when the child list is presented. And then when that child is carried forward and has a genealogical summary for their own family, we repeat that number so we know who they are. So here is William Henry Martin's genealogical summary. And at the very beginning, you'll see the bold number 23 followed by a period. That's William's unique identification number. His spouse was not assigned a number. They don't assign numbers in either system to the spouses. But if I go through down to his child list, then his children will receive in order the next three numbers, 24, 25, and 26. And you can see those are set out there ahead of the birth order numbers. They're not bold and they don't have a period following them. But those are unique to those individuals, and we'll see those numbers used again when those individuals are discussed in their own generation. Now that we understand our four basic sets of numbers and we've incorporated them into our narrative, it's time to give a little more thought to those special cases that we might encounter. How do we include these special individuals into the family structure effectively and clearly without creating confusion? One of the most common situations we encounter in our families are multiple marriages. After Emma's mother died, William Henry Martin remarried, and he had more children with his second wife. So here is a little structure for their family tree with William Henry Martin, his first wife Mary Elizabeth Turner, and with her he had Charles, Emma, and Frank. When Mary Turner died, he remarried to Mary Jane Bryan, and he had more children, Nancy, Bert, and Cora. When I present that in my narrative, then, I create two separate child lists. First, I present his children with Mary Turner, because she was his first spouse, Charles, Emma, and Frank. And they receive that birth order 1, 2, 3 in Roman numerals. They've got their numbers assigned. And then I create a separate child list for the children that he had with his second wife. And here I have a choice. Because they are still his children, and this is the Martin story, I could continue 4, 5, 6 Roman numerals of birth order. Or I could restart with 1, 2, 3 again. Either way is perfectly acceptable to designate birth order for the two separate sets of children. The generational designations remain in place, and the first child in the child list receives the next generation number, We just do it with the first child in the list, and then the rest are inferred from that. So we don't need to keep going through the child list with that designation. We introduce the child list and identify and clarify whose children these are. Finally, they are assigned their individual identification numbers sequentially. Stepchildren are handled in a similar manner. If this were the Bryan family history, as opposed to the Martin family history, we would present these children a little differently. We would begin by talking about the children that Mary Jane Bryan had with her husband, William Martin. They had Nancy, Bert, and Cora. And those would be listed in birth order, lowercase Roman numeral, 1, 2, 3. Then we would list her stepchildren with William. The stepchildren of Mary Jane Bryan, and we would very clearly explain as we introduce these children that these are the children born to her husband, William Henry Martin, and his first wife, Mary Turner. We would list those children in a separate child list then, Charles, Emma, and Frank. However, Mary Jane Bryan did not give birth to these children, so they do not receive birth order numbers. The Bryan family history designated Mary Jane as generation 3 of the Bryan family, so her children with William Martin would be generation 4 of the Bryan family. William Henry, because he's not discussed in any other aspect of the Bryan family history, is a generation 1 for his Martin family here, and that would mean his children would receive generational designation 2 as his children, but not the Bryan family. They all receive that special unique identification number in the quarterly system all the way through. So anytime you encounter special cases, and I know there are many different scenarios, it all boils down to this. How does this child relate to the parents? And by what surname will that child be known? Create separate child lists when necessary to avoid confusion and foster clarity in these relationships. And then explain yourself. Explain yourself in those child list introductions. If that child is carried forward and discussed in their own right in another generation, you will need to re-explain it all in that genealogical summary for that child, and in any summaries of descent in which they are included. So it's just a matter of making sure you're providing relationship clarity and eliminating confusion. Happily, there is an entire chapter devoted to this in Numbering Your Genealogy, Complex Families by Madeline Cohn Crane, and it covers a variety of these topics and will help you through the process. We've talked about the register system and the quarterly system, and for the most part they are very similar. We've mostly looked at examples using the quarterly system. But now let's look a little bit at how they are alike and how they differ. Obviously, they both use 4 sets of numbers, but there are some cosmetic differences. The register system for the genealogical summary uses a boldface and small capitals for the names. And then the parenthetical summary of descent is italicized. Those superscript generational numbers are not italicized. So it's just kind of the opposite of what the quarterly does. Here you see an example for Emma Blanche. I've got that boldface, small caps, and then that italicized summary of descent. But you can see that the generational designations are not italicized. The quarterly system uses boldface for the names, but superscript generational numbers are italicized. So it's just a slightly different look. Source citations. The quarterly system are in text and superscript, regular type, usually following punctuation. Emma Blanche Martin married William James Dooley, 30 November 1893 in Van Buren County. We have that superscript number 1. It's not italicized. That's so we know that it's not a generational number, and it's after a period. The register system does much the same thing, but they tend to put the superscript number for the footnotes in brackets. So here you see at the end of that punctuation that number 1 is in a bracket. The child lists in both systems use 1 point smaller font. The register system uses small capitals for the names, and it's okay in the register system to use abbreviations for births, marriages, deaths. The quarterly system will use all capitals for the names, and they prefer not to abbreviate the information within the child list. Those Arabic identification numbers, this is where there's the biggest difference between the two systems. The register system only assigns an identification number to those individuals who will be carried forward for further discussion in the next generation. So in our Martin story, we started with William Martin. He received that first identification number of 1. If I'm only going to carry forward his son Robert, Robert receives number 2 as an identification number. Josiah Martin receives identification number 3 if he is the only son carried forward, the only child carried forward. And when I see that in the child list then, first I can see it here in the genealogical summary. There's that Arabic number 2 for Robert Martin. Down here in his child list, Josiah has number 3. He's carried forward, and that's the clue that you look for more about Josiah in the next generation discussion. Because the others did not receive a number, you know they're not discussed further after the child list. That's register system. The quarterly system assigns an Arabic identification number to all the known individuals. Still not the spouses, but all those family individuals. And they designate the one that's going to be carried forward in the child list with a little plus sign. So here all these children of Robert and Betty received their unique identification number, 345, and the one that's carried forward is Josiah, so he gets a little plus sign in front of his name. All right, you've done a great job. You've written this joyful story, you've documented your sources, formatted everything in a way that generations from now will still be readable and usable. Let's talk a little bit here as we end our time about some useful extras you might want to consider including. Your word processor, if you're using a computer, can generate a lot of these goodies for you. One thing that's not really an extra is pagination. Regardless of how long or how short your work is, I highly recommend that you paginate it. And your software can do that for you. Your word processing software can do that. That's really a must. People need to be able to navigate without getting lost. A title page is lovely for your family. And these are templates sometimes that, like Microsoft Word has some templates you can use. You can create your own. Something a little artistic for your family is lovely. A table of contents is very helpful, especially as your works become longer. You can break it down by generations. You can break it down with each generation into the families that are discussed in that table of contents, so people can navigate right to the place where they want to go and read about that story. An index, an every name index and a locations index. And again, word processors can help with this. That's really nice to have as people want to go back and forth and look at people in different contexts within the broad structure of the work. And finally, pedigree charts, perhaps something a little more ornamental as a chart, but something that gives the entire picture of this family. that people can see where each individual that you are going to discuss fits the full story picture. All of this is really a great help to your readers and a wonderful addition for the future. Writing joy and meeting standards. You can do both. You've got some tools now to get started. I hope you feel inspired and energized to share what you've learned about your family in a written format that will stand the test of time. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I will be available in the chat room to answer your questions. Good luck on your genealogical journey.